Let's talk about frame rate and shutter speed and how those two things are related. When you think about videos or movies, it's best to think about them the same way you would think about a flip book, with a stick figure running. The more pieces of paper you have in the flip book, the more detailed that motion is going to feel, and the more realistic it will feel as if the stick figure is actually running. The fewer pieces of paper you have, the more gaps there are between the motion, and the more it feels like what we think of as stop motion. Movies and TV, in the cinematic sense, the industry standard is 24 frames per second. 24 frames meaning 24 photos per second. 24 pieces of paper in our flip book for every second of video. In Europe and on Instagram and many other social platforms, 30 frames per second is the standard. That's 30 photos for every 1 second of video. What makes soap operas, daytime television, and like the NFL broadcast look so hyper-realistic is because those are shot in 60 frames per second. Every second of video, you're seeing 60 individual photos, which gives a hyper-realistic sense because you're getting so much information in detail per second. Every time you hear a photo click, you're hearing the sound of the shutter opening and closing. And the amount of time that that shutter is open and closed, exposing the sensor to light, is the amount of time we call the shutter speed. And the longer that shutter is open, the more time is passing, and anything in the photo that's moving is going to start to appear smudged and blurred. The shorter the amount of time, the fast click, is referred to as a high shutter speed, and you're more likely to capture tack-sharp motion with no motion blur. Let's start by watching 7 seconds of this video.
My name is Leah Balagopal, and I'm a rock climber, surfer, and art conservator based in Brooklyn, New York.
In movies and film, there's a standard for how the shutter speed should relate to the frame rate. If we think about 1 second of video in 24 frames, we should expect a 1 second block of time subdivided into 24 even pieces. Each one of those pieces corresponds to 1/24th of a second. That's what 24 frames per second looks like. There's a rule in movies and film that the denominator of your shutter speed should be double the amount of frames that you have. That is, every 1/24th of a second, the camera should have its shutter open for half of that time. Half of a 24th is a 48th. And so, for every 24th of a second, every frame in your video, you're taking a picture for half of that time. And the back half, the back 1/48th of a second is missing. And then the next moment, you take a photo, that's 1/40th of a second. The next 1/40th of a second is missing, and so on. This relationship of a shutter speed that is half the length of one of the frames is said to be the closest approximation to how the human eye perceives motion. So here we can see what 1 second of video looks like in 24 frames per second, where each shot is a photo with the shutter speed 1/48th of a second, 24 distinct photos making up 1 second of video. The same is true if we shoot at 30 frames per second, where 1 second of video is subdivided into 30 even pieces, each frame representing 1/30th of a second, following the same rule where we want the shutter open for half the length of one frame. Half of 1/30th of a second is 1/60th of a second. Each frame of a 30 frames video is shot at 1/60th of a second. Finally, if you want to shoot 60 frames per second, each frame is 1/60th of a second. Half of those frames is 1/120th of a second. So your shutter speed for 60 frames footage is 1/120th. I don't know how to end this.